Let me preface this encounter with a bit of background, as I'll most likely post more of my encounters as I find them. You see, I'm in my mid-20s, but due to my father's work, I've been all over the globe. In the space of 11 years, from 8-ish to 19, I lived for varying amounts of time in 5 different countries, while visiting about 6 or 7 more. All of this not including my home country and very short less than 3-week holidays. This, coupled with my bipolarity, type 1 with rare MDEs, and functioning insomnia, has made me keep a meticulous journal from the moment I could write, and later type. It's also given me a whole truckload of experiences that make me feel lucky, but of course, for all the good, there's some bad mixed in. This encounter is actually the reason I found this sub in the first place. Until yesterday, I had no idea this place existed, but my friend recommended this place after I told her about this incident, and here I am. For the past 10 months or so, I've worked as a night porter in a pretty well-known hotel in a medium-sized city in the UK. This place has been around for decades, and is immensely popular for its funeral teas and wakes, as morbid as that is. This is because it's across the road from one of the larger local cemeteries, about a kilometer from one of the larger churches, and to top it off, less than 3 kilometers from the crematorium, perfectly suited for the mourner's business. So a couple of weeks ago, I almost finished my shift when the sweet old guy that's the cemetery's groundskeeper came in on the verge of tears. I'll call him Jacob, and he's literally the epitome of adorable, a kind old man. He volunteered to work there, even when he was retired, because that's just how nice he was. But anyways, Jacob came in at about 7:50-ish as I was waiting for the morning shift folks to turn up so I could go home. He started blabbering incoherently as the emotional often do, so I told him to calm down and asked him if he wanted something to drink. Obviously that was a yes, so 5 minutes later he sat down with a cup of tea, telling me what's wrong. Some idiots had jumped the fence and overturned a bunch of headstones, spray-painted vile crap on epitaphs, and even partially dug into some graves. By the time he had calmed down, I said my shift was finished, and told I'd help get the gravestones upright at least. The man was too precious, and I had to help. Roll on a couple of hours, and all the stones were back in order, and I went home shattered. Those things are heavy as hell, but I was happy to have helped. I told my work I'd probably be a little late, and they understood. Anyway, I get to my shift a couple hours late, and it turns out I'm going to be on my own after 2, as my colleague's second job needed him early as hell. Ironically, his second job is sandblasting granite headstones. 2 a.m. comes and goes. Everything was almost in order, and I was just adding finishing touches to a large funeral tea in one of our function suites, when I hear a knocking noise. At first, I thought it was someone in the room upstairs walking the halls and dismissed it, but the knocking happened again, this time louder. 3rd time's the charm, and I finally found the source. One of the fire exits next to the function suite, but more specifically, the fire exit directly across the cemetery. Obviously, I wasn't going to open the door, and I couldn't even if I wanted to, as they're all alarmed at night. But that didn't matter, as the knocking stopped suddenly. Not for long, though. The knocking started again from another fire exit close to the car park and front exit. It was much louder now, so I knew exactly where it was coming from straight away. And then it stopped again. In a bit of a minor panic, I sprinted my way towards the front door and made sure it was locked, then grabbed the night porter's friend from behind reception. A walking stick. I could see my visitor's silhouette in the car park, walking slowly towards the entrance. It was definitely a man, at least a foot taller and a little bit broader than me. He was wearing one of those stupid ankle-length goth trench coats with the hood and buckles by the billionfold. He stopped just outside the line of the front entrance, but he was obviously staring right at me, and I could faintly make out his creepy shit-eating smile. When he started taking something from behind his back, I braced, thinking what he could have had in his hands. It looked like a very large brick or something, so I thought he would try to smash the front door. But no, he did something far stranger. He just placed the brick thing on the ground slowly at his feet. Then with a weirdly chipper demeanor, he waved and flashed another toothy predatory grin at me before backing off into the darkness towards the cemetery entrance. Needless to say, I waited and checked the cameras around the building before venturing out to see what he left me. It ended up being one of those small headstone markers with the words, "You forgot this one," sprayed over it in green paint. To add even more creep factor, the stone was for a bloody baby's grave, and the old one at that. Not cool at all. I locked up again and phoned the police. A couple of hours later, and a lot of footage from the CCTV scanned, the police left with a fuzzy frame shot of him that was basically a shape of dark on dark, and nothing else to go by. So Midnight Goth Grave Robber, let's not meet again, please. So let me start off by saying I move around a lot, in between SoCal and Arizona. At the time of this, December 2015, I was still living in Southern California, at my grandmother's apartments. I had gotten a seasonal job at Toys R Us to do something with my time, and to learn some people skills. I'm a 24-year-old girl, and have some pretty extreme social anxiety, and find it pretty hard to talk to people. So I figured the job would help. Another important thing to mention, my grandmother is on a government program with reduced housing cost, and has a 2-bedroom apartment ever since my grandfather passed. But due to the annual check at her complex, she's supposed to be the only inhabitant of her dwelling, so technically I wasn't supposed to be living there with her. She liked the help in the company, and I liked being rent-free. Now, since I wasn't supposed to be there, I technically had to sneak around, and most definitely couldn't park on the parking grounds for the complex, as it would draw some attention. There was a cemetery across the street from the complex, and then half a mile of houses down the street next to the cemetery, along which most of the visitors for the houses and apartments nearby, including myself, parked. I was getting free rent and staying with my grandma, which was awesome to me even if it meant I had to usually park half a mile away from the complex. I didn't really mind the walk. So all was well for a few months from when I got the job in October, minus a scary incident with the stalker at work, which I'll leave for another time. But eventually, they started putting me on night shifts, which I definitely didn't mind since I tend to be a night owl anyway. Also, if you've ever been on the closing shift at any retail store, you know you can easily stay an hour or two overtime after the store closes, doing reshop during the holiday season. It was early December at the time, and I ended up getting off work past 2 a.m. Around this hour, at this time of year in this part of SoCal, the mist gets unbearably thick, to the point of having to drive 30 miles per hour down the freeway with brights on, and still being unable to see a foot or two in front of your car. Tonight was one of those nights. I wasn't too bothered by it at that time, but it does set off my anxiety a little bit, so by the time I got home, and it took me nearly 20 minutes to find a parking space, I was really anxious. Of course, with my luck, I parked at the very end of the half-mile stretch. Now, it's kind of a tradition of mine to get out of the car, close the door, and linger near my car for a minute while I audibly stretch a bit and sometimes complain. Fuck, today sucked, and that sort of thing. It's just a little habit thing I do, and tonight was no different. I immediately after tucked my purse under my arm, turned on my phone flashlight and stuck it in front of my face to see where I was going, because the fog was so thick I couldn't see a foot in front of me. I had walked in this weather many times before, so I knew the way home. A straight shot walk for half a mile, and then a sharp left at the end of the cemetery, then crossing the street and into the gated complex. So I was on my merry way, until I heard it. A loud, almost obnoxious cough, and footsteps. My alert mode set in, and I instantly started walking faster, and trying to be quieter about my movements. Call me paranoid, but I've had a fair number of let's not meet moments, and I certainly wasn't keen about meeting the stranger walking behind me, especially given the fact that I can't see in front of my face, even with the streetlights and my phone flashlight. And this continues for a few minutes, with an occasional cough behind me, when I hear a whistle. The kind cat collars do, which bewilders me because 1, you can't see shit, and 2, since you can't see shit in this weather, I assume the person is purposely intimidating me, at which point I give up on walking and break into a run. Their steps behind me break into a full-blown run, and I hear panting. Clearly the dude isn't in the best of shape. Neither am I, but the run didn't win me as bad. By now I'm speed-walking next to the cemetery, and for some god-forsaken reason, my panicked mind tells me it would be better to duck into the cemetery and hide, instead of just walk straight home. Had there been no fog, I would have had a clear view of my grandmother's apartment from the area in the cemetery where I stood. I quickly hid by crouching behind the entrance post to the cemetery gates, and I knew I fucked up. I heard his footsteps stop too, and I could tell he knew I was hiding because of my lack of audible footsteps. I crouched there for what seemed like 10 minutes, too scared to turn on my phone for fear of him being close enough to see the light and find me, and too scared to make a run for it, for fear that he was intently listening out for me. I had figured out he was standing probably 10 feet from where I was at the entrance driveway to the cemetery, right before the gates, which was confirmed when after minutes I heard his voice say, "I know you're there, sweetheart." I heard the distinct sound of a lighter being struck, and then smelled cigarette smoke. I figured the dude was focused on a cigarette, and I made a run for it across the cemetery, somehow not tripping over any graves, all while intently trying to listen behind me. The cemetery's main entrance has wrought iron fencing, but the back and right end is wooden, and serves as a separator between the cemetery and the backyard of various houses, and the other side is chain link. There's no other entrance or exit to the cemetery, but I know the chain link fence doesn't go all the way to the ground, so I laid on my stomach, pushed the fence out and up, wriggled across, and ran directly across the street to my grandma's house, pounding on her door until she opened. I don't know how this dude found me. He must have been standing around nearby as I parked, and heard me complain to myself loudly when I got out of the car, but either way, that was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. I'm a female, and when I was 16, I hung out mostly with a small group of friends. Toby was gay. John was a small guy who posed at being macho, and a foreign exchange student from Spain named Maria. At the time, both I and John had a bit of a crush on Maria since she was bisexual. We both attempted to impress her any time the opportunity arose. Anyway, on to the story. One night in October, we were all hanging out at Toby's, smoking weed like the fly little shits we were, and Maria said that she wished she could do something scary since Halloween was close, and it was her first time in the States. Me, being the absolute coward that I am, loved the idea of doing scary things like ghost hunts, but actually doing them freaked me out. Wanting to impress her with my bravery, or stupidity, however you look at it, I suggested going to this place called Spider Gates. It's an old cemetery in Leicester, Massachusetts, and that's a bit of a hike into the woods, and super old. It was supposed to be super haunted, too. So we drove half an hour in my dad's beat-up Pathfinder to the middle of nowhere, until we came to the path that led deep into the woods where the cemetery was. I parked across the street. The car didn't really lock because it was so old and beat up, so we just left it and took the keys with us. We smoked a bowl or two on our way to the cemetery, and once we got there, we were stoned out of our minds. So we walk around the cemetery for a little while, and nothing significant really happens. We hear some rustling, which was probably just animals and the wind blowing through the trees. It made eerie howling sounds, but was nothing out of the ordinary. We go to a part of the cemetery where the ground is raised a bit, like you're standing on a stage, and there are trees surrounding it basically in a circle, and we smoke some more. We were there for what must have been like 20 minutes, just talking and smoking and laughing about stupid stuff, when we heard loud, heavy crunches through the leaves and twigs, coming from deeper into the woods from the opposite direction we had come. It didn't sound like an animal. We all quieted down and looked, but it had stopped as suddenly as it started. We shrugged it off real quick and went back to smoking. John and I tried to flirt pathetically with Maria, while Toby flirted with John, and it was a pretty good night. Then Maria stops and tells us to look into the woods. Right where she was pointing, probably about 50 to 100 yards away, was a point of light. It basically looked like somebody was just holding a flashlight pointed towards us, but they were so far away that the beam didn't actually reach us. A few seconds later it went out, and we could hear this really weird high-pitched hyena-like laughing. I'm talking some crazed maniacal clown-like shit. What the hell was that? We're miles away from any houses. Before anybody really said anything, another light flashed on, this time a bit closer, and probably 50 or so yards to the left of the first one. We could hear running through the woods from the direction of the first light when the second went out with the same creepy laughter. We communally decided to nope the fuck out of there, and started pretty hastily back down the trail. It was a really dark night. I think the clouds were heavily in front of the moon, so seeing anything besides what our cell phones illuminated in the night was pretty impossible. A couple of minutes down the path, we start to calm down a bit and talk about what had just happened. But after only a few seconds of calm, the heavy footsteps started up behind us in the leaves. We stopped and turned. About 50 feet behind us, only barely visible, was the outline of something in the middle of the path. I probably would have crapped myself if I wasn't so high. John, being the brave macho guy, stepped out and yelled at whatever it was to leave us alone. A light switched on, I'm assuming in the person's hand, and they didn't move. They just stood there holding the light. This time they were close enough for the beam to fall onto us, however. John yelled at the person for another 30 seconds or so before they turned off the light and we could see him walking away. All the while we heard the same crazy laughing from far deep into the woods. We quickly made our way out of there and went back to the car. We got ready to drive as far away as we could, but when I turned the key, nothing. Not even the slow turning over. Nothing at all. John liked to think he knew about cars, so we all got out and looked under the hood. The two cables that connect the battery were hanging free. The screws that attached them around the poster terminals, or whatever you call them, were missing. He didn't know if we could reconnect them without the screws, and honestly, I still don't, so we decided to try and call for help. No cell service. What do we do now? We're in the middle of the woods with a dead car and no way to contact anybody, and we were sure those creeps weren't far behind because we could hear them like hyenas playing manhunt in the forest. Luckily, a minute or so after that, a car came down the road, and seeing our hood up, pulled to the side of the road to see if we needed help. I was really happy to see that it was two older women, and not some maniacally laughing freak. We gladly accepted a ride from them to the nearest place with cell service, and called my parents to pick us up. Needless to say, they were sort of upset with us for going to the cemetery in the first place, since it's technically trespassing, and for leaving the car there. But overall, they were glad we were fine after getting in the car with strangers, however nice and innocent they were. The next day, my dad, Toby, and I went back to get the car. Weirdly enough, we both had cell service this time. Not sure what was going on there. I'm just glad those two old women came by and offered a ride when they did. I'm not exactly sure if they were just having some twisted version of fun, or if they were out to do actual harm, but I'm glad we never got the chance to find out. This story happened when I was around 10 years of age, and involves 4 of my childhood friends. In case you didn't know, I'm a 28-year-old female, and from a very country southern state. This was the most awful thing I'd been through in my entire life. This story takes place back in the mountains. I was always so excited to see the weekend approaching, partially because I had a pretty cool mom. She would always take me places with my friends, and pretty much let us always have a little freedom. The other part is I always get to spend weekends with my friends. So my friend Belinda asked if she could come spend the weekend with me. I asked my mom, who said yes. I waited until her mom dropped her off at the bottom of my hill and walked down to meet her. We walked excitedly back to my house, and my mom said her best friend, Chris, who's a female, called and asked if he wanted to come up to their mountain home for a visit. My mom asked if Belinda and I wanted to go. We replied with a hell yes. Chris's kids are Alan and Jay, who happen to be two of my best friends. Belinda had a crush on Alan, and I was secretly in love with Jay. We left our house within 10 minutes and descended to their home. As I said, they live on top of a huge mountain. It's a very dense forest for miles beyond miles. So after 20 minutes of driving, we finally made it to their home. My mom went in and was greeted by Chris. Belinda and I stayed out to talk with Alan and Jay, who also had a few other friends with them. We knew everyone there and talked to them. Scott being the oldest, Jay being the second oldest, Ray, and then Alan being the youngest. They all kept going on and on about this cabin they had built far out into the woods. It was probably about 3 miles into the forest from their house. The boys wanted to take us down to explore it. We agreed. I was used to roaming half of these woods, and I always loved venturing out into them. I grew up there my whole life. Well, that all changed after this. We told them we had to ask my mom and use the bathroom before we could go. They sniggered, jumped onto their ATVs, and screamed that they were going ahead of us, and told us to follow when we were done. We go into the house and take care of our business, and ask our mom if we could go. We were in a hurry to catch up to the boys. She said yes, but for us to be careful, so we race out of the house as fast as we can. We start walking down their hill to descend to the main dirt road. We had to walk approximately half of a mile to get to the road that led to the cabin, and it was all mostly downhill, except for the main flat bottom road. We skipped merrily along, talking about the guys as we're going. They always liked playing pranks and jokes on me, since I was like their sister and grew up with them. I told Belinda that I had a feeling they were going to jump out and scare us or something. Little did I know I was in for a different surprise. We walked about another 2.5 miles to eventually reach this cabin. It felt like it took forever, as this wasn't a road but a path. When we finally reach it, no one was at the site. We walk onto the little porch and knock on the door, waiting for one of the guys to jump out and try to scare us. We step back and marvel at the little cabin. Jay really did a good job on it. He was always into building, creating, and growing things. I finally check the door and step into a little room. The cabin only had 2 rooms, so it wasn't very big at all. No one appears to be inside or in the general area. All we can hear are the sounds of wildlife. So we stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. It was then that we heard an ATV a little ways above the cabin. Not towards the main road, but further down the path. We follow the sounds and finally see the guys. They're speeding off down the path. Stop long enough to yell for us to keep following them and take off down the path of the woods. Belinda expresses concern and just wants to go back the way we came to the house. It was probably around 3 in the evening, and she didn't want to be out in the woods anymore. I, on the other hand, was a little explorer. I wanted to keep going down the path, thinking somehow we could find the guys and possibly prank them. Boy, do I regret doing that now. So we take off further down the path after I talk Belinda into it. We walk for like 2 hours before we both realize that we are completely lost. We came to a fork in the road, and there stood a tree with 2 arrows pointing to either side of the split road. I forgot to mention that it was summertime, and the daylight was very long. It doesn't get dark until around 8 in the summer. We had walked for probably about 2 hours in total so far, and seriously didn't know which side to go. My friend started to panic a bit, and I tried to calm her down, assuring her that we had plenty of daylight ahead and would make it back in plenty of time, although personally I wasn't so sure of that. We were about 7 miles into the woods that were endless at this time. Had no idea of our location either, so we both decided to stick towards the right of the mountain. We took off. I laughed, and we made plans to get the boys back. After walking for what seemed like forever, we somehow ended back to the split road. It was growing far darker, nearly dusk with every minute. By this time, my friend and I were totally freaking out. She was sobbing and asking me how we were going to find our way back out. I tried to stay calm and reassure her that we would make it back, but on the inside I was just as scared as her. At that time we stood frozen on the road, trying to figure out where to go next. That's when about 15 yards back, I heard a twig snap. I shushed Belinda and asked her if she heard that. She started smiling and was about to call out for our guy friends when I stopped her suddenly. I told her to stay quiet for a minute. We continued to hear the footsteps. For some reason, I felt more terrified than I ever had my entire life. I whispered to Belinda to start walking slowly down the left fork. The footsteps kept inching closer to our location. We tried to be as quiet as we could, but there were dried leaves all under us. For some reason, I had a gut feeling that these footsteps didn't belong to any of our friends. I had the awful feeling of dread, and my friends started to pick up on that. As the footsteps started sounding closer and faster, I decided to book it down this path, and my friend followed. I felt like I was running for my life, and that if I slowed down, I wasn't going to ever make it back or go home again. We finally reached this embankment off the side of the path, so we decided to climb up. I tore into the mountainside with my feet, my legs, and scratched myself along the way. We could see their barn up ahead of us, which was old and hadn't been used in a long time. The footsteps still kept approaching after a short pause. My guess is they were quieter as they reached the mountain. We had descended into some tall grassy fields, which made it easier to mask any sounds. As I finally realized our surroundings, I remembered their family graveyard was up ahead of the barn. It was very old and had very large headstones, as well as some crypts. I decided that was our best chance to hide and get a view of who this person was who was chasing us. We ran through the old iron gate and hid behind the largest tomb we could find. It grew very quiet as we stood frozen. My mind was racing, my body was shaking, and my heart was beating beyond control. Who was chasing us from the woods? What did they want from us? I had so many questions that may never get answered. Belinda and I sat there for what seemed like an eternity, but it was probably more around 10 minutes. It gave us a chance to calm down, correct our breathing, and cool down from our run. We finally decided to stand up halfway so that we could see if anyone was around us. We crept to our feet, still crouching behind the grave. What we saw made us almost literally pee our pants. There, at the beginning of the cemetery, stood a man. He was probably about 6 feet tall, appeared to weigh 170 pounds, and was wearing dark clothing. His eyes looked dark and wild. He stood there searching the graveyard, trying to listen for us. We immediately both ducked back down behind the stone. We both started breathing heavily again, scared to death he had saw us raise up. Belinda shot me a look as the man started rustling around. I peered up again, and this time his gaze met mine. He turned his body towards our hiding place, locked his gaze on me, and smiled a wicked smile. He then said, "There you are." I didn't even hesitate. I screamed to Belinda. We both jumped up and started running towards the back of the cemetery fence. The man started chasing after us, but luckily for us, this cemetery had a very short fence. We hurriedly hopped over and began to run in the direction of the house. We ran out of the clearing and reached the gravel road. We didn't slow down, stop, or look behind us. We just ran as fast as we could towards the house. The gravel loud beneath our feet. We made it part ways up there and at the bottom of their road. The boys all stood looking very worried. We ran up to them so fast that they jumped. I ran into Scott's arms crying, with Belinda right beside me. She was crying too. Both of us looked to be a hot mess, bleeding from the earlier climb, sweaty, and our appearance very disheveled. We suddenly turned, remembering the reason for our panic, to see a man running back towards the graveyard. Scott, Jay, and Alan all screaming, chasing after him. We never saw him again. The boys chased him into the woods and couldn't catch up to him, so they came back and walked us up to the house. They all started crying, feeling very bad for trying to mess with us earlier. Our parents were waiting on us, scared to death. Jay and the boys admitted to leaving us and taking off into the woods, thinking it was funny and that we would find our way back. As it grew later, they began to worry about us and had gone back through to search for us. When they couldn't find us, they went to all of our parents and admitted what they did. They all went to search for us and started to panic when they couldn't find us. Chris had actually been on the phone with 911 when we arrived, about to send out a search and rescue for us. We had been gone for close to 5 hours. We told them the story about the man who had followed us. The police showed up to question us all and asked for the man's description. They searched through the woods and the mountain, but they never found any trace of him. I never went back to that cabin or to that part of the woods again. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments below, as well as perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a personal story that you'd like to submit, or you'd like to just send me a message, links to all of my social media will be in the description for the video below. This includes my Gmail, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the theme of the story is, if it has any, the name of the story, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you're curious at all about the music used in this video, the music is always listed in the description below, in the order which it appears. I also have links to the artists and list the tracks by name, just in case you want to find more of their work. Last but not least, if you have any criticism, please be sure to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.